Good day to you. I'm just sitting here reading a magazine. Yeah, it's a Life magazine special edition of my favorite band, the Rolling Stones. Yeah, some of the photos in here are incredible, like this one. Where do you see a suit like that? If you know the 1960s, you know that that's fashion from the 1960s. These really wide pinstripe suits. Yeah, where do you see a photo? You know Mick Jagger? He's the lead singer for the Rolling Stones. They're playing right now. They've been touring for 50 years. Longer than that, actually. Pretty wild photo. That is the magazine. The magazine is the king of photos. And that's what makes it, above all else, a unique mass medium. That's what we're talking about today as we take on this new chapter. We're talking about sort of an extension off of the book. Last time we established that a medium was invented that came out of the alphabet, came out of paper, ended up in this thing that you can hold in your hands. Now we get something similar. We get the magazine. We get the magazine and the photograph, making the photograph king. And in fact, the very most important part of a magazine is that front page, that front cover. That is what is going to make or break whether the magazine is adopted by a reader. Yeah, so we're going to take on the magazine today. And isn't it interesting that the shape of the magazine is like our tablets today? And actually, where does that word tablet comes from? It comes from the clay tablets. So the magazine is actually borrowing a format. It is taller than it is wider. It's taller than it is wider. It's borrowing the tablet format from clay tablets. And there's a reason for that, and that is because when you have a vertical format like that, it's better at showing people because people are vertical, right? If this was a square, it wouldn't be as well suited to showing the elongated bodies of people. All right, so let's move on now and talk about the magazine, how it developed throughout the culture of the United States as a medium, and then what kinds of effects it's had on the way that people believe and think and behave. This is the similar way that we're approaching all technologies in this class. And we'll start with the idea that the magazine, as we mentioned last time, was the first to develop a national culture. The first to develop a national culture. Prior to the magazine, people were mainly living, at least in their mental space, in Stroudsburg or in Pennsylvania, or at the very most, the Northeast. With the magazine, you start to think of yourself as an American. And that's because magazines started to provide in-depth news and photos about people that would be of appeal to everybody, no matter what state that you lived in. The very first magazine in the United States was founded in 1704, before the country was formed, right? 1704, Daniel Defoe, Defoe. His magazine was founded in New England. It was called The Review. Even though it's called a magazine by today's standards, it really looked more like a newspaper at that time. And the kinds of things that it covered was not what we think of today, not celebrities. Photographs weren't even around, so celebrities, that's not going to be of importance. So weren't even celebrities back then, at least the way that we envision them. Now, magazines are much more serious. They covered public policy, policy, for example, like drinking in public policy about speeding, public policy about where you park your horses, colors public policy, literature, serious literature, and morals. Usually religious-based morals. So what exactly is a magazine and Defoe's conception of it? Why is his thing called a magazine? A magazine is a periodical that contains articles of lasting interest. It's a periodical, so it comes out regularly. It's not like once and done, right? It's once a month or once a week or sometimes once a year, special edition Life magazine once a year. But the articles are of lasting interest. They're not going to be tied to something that happened yesterday. It's going to be about like taxation and whether we agree with taxation, or it's going to be about cosmetic surgery. It's going to be about something that's going to be of importance for a long period of time. It has a long arc. And so magazines originally were intended for a broader geographic area than newspapers. Newspapers we haven't studied yet, but they're supposed to be local just for people within, delivery of the newspapers range. Magazines going national. Let's talk about the early magazines now. The early magazines were, first one we have Ben Franklin. Here he is again. Ben Franklin's The General magazine. That was the name of it, The General magazine. And he tried to, remember I talked last time about he's a media mogul? He got burned this time. He tried to hire one of the most famous editors in the United States to be the editor of this magazine, the American magazine. The guy's name was John Webb. And John Webb got stolen by a competitor editor named Andrew Bradford. And Andrew Bradford had the American magazine. So it's a little bit of a behind the scenes showing already media business, people duking it out, trying to raise the profile of their business empire. One of the most famous magazines to come out early on was called the Saturday Evening Post. The Saturday Evening Post. The Saturday Evening Post used to publish Edgar Allan Poe poems. Yeah, it was a magazine that started to become popular as more people had leisure time. People are working in the factories and it's a long, hard day, but it's not the same as working on a farm where you're literally working from morning till night. So you have some leisure time when you're working in the factories. You have some extra money. There's no television. You have some needs for entertainment. You're stuck in your small apartment building in the city. You start reading magazines. You start reading stories like Edgar Allan Poe and his tales of horror inside the magazines. That's the way that magazines were read back then. And by the way, the Saturday Evening Post published one of the most famous political cartoon essayists, if you want to call him that, Norman Rockwell. Do you know Norman Rockwell? You've probably seen Norman Rockwell in a lot of the homes that you've been in. He's very popular in American homes. Paintings of awkward boys and girls with kites and golf putters, and they're usually in houses, Norman Rockwell paintings. I hope you've seen some. All right, let's move on now to the birth of photojournalism. I said early on that photos is what makes the magazine the king. The magazine is king of photos. And so photojournalism is the idea that a photo is telling a news story. And that news story is probably going to have a greater impact than seeing a photograph that is the Queen of England, for example. So photojournalism, how does that come about? Well, in the 1880s, this is when industrialization, after it started to take place, in industrialization, a new technique was invented called the halftone. The halftone. And basically it's a bunch of black dots that if you poke a dot with paper, you can actually make an image come out of that. Black dots, or halftones, were used to create photos for magazines. It's a pretty technical process, so I can't get more into detail on that, but basically the invention of halftones allowed magazines to print photos, and that changed the whole scene. One of the first persons to explore that was Matthew Brady. Matthew Brady, professional photographer, and he shot photos of the Civil War. And he showed American soldiers, Northern soldiers and Southern soldiers, black soldiers and white soldiers, laying next to each other, dead in fields. Rows after rows of people laying by the side of the road, laying in fields. And his photos had such a tremendous impact. It was the first time that people could really see firsthand the horrors of war if you're not actually fighting in the war. Before that, you're reading about it. It's not the same as to see bloody people, brothers, right? Brothers from different sides of the country, the North versus the South, laying next to each other. Those photos really had a profound influence. And they used to appear in a magazine called Harper's Weekly. And they started to change people's perception of the war. People wanted that war to end more quickly because of his photos. Also, the photograph becomes a way of documenting history, right? We don't have the ability to look back and see a photograph of Abraham Lincoln. No, that was too long ago. Wait, do we? Yeah, we do have the ability to see Abraham Lincoln. Let me pick somebody earlier. George Washington. We don't have the ability to see George Washington. All we have the ability to see is a painting of George Washington, which is not going to be as accurate as a photo. So a photo starts to preserve history for us in ways that we didn't have possible in the past. It's a new development in human consciousness in a way, is that we're able to record history in a much more accurate fashion because of the photo and because of the magazine. Actually, historians go back and look at magazines from the 1920s when they're doing historical research. All right, now let's talk about the economics of business. Of the business of magazine publishing. Just like we ended with books last time talking about book publishing, magazines grow into a very, very big business. After the Civil War, magazines, remember, no television, no radio, there's no competition. It's the form of entertainment. It's in the home. People can read it. People can afford it. It's national. Magazines started to flourish. Lots of titles started to be developed. Popular Science, Good Housekeeping, National Geographic, Vogue. These are all magazines that are called consumer magazines. Magazines that are designed to target like-minded consumers. So you're going to read stories in those magazines and you're going to see ads, skincare products, cars, whatever it is that you're interested in, you're going to see ads in that magazine that are ads that appeal to you in the same way or similar ways than those ads appeal to other people who are reading the magazine. It's a consumer-based magazine. And these ads, they get their money from subscriptions. When you pay for a subscription, they get their money from newsstand sales. You buy an individual magazine, and they get their money from advertising. And advertising is the greatest source of revenue for magazines. And in fact, our tolerance for advertising is very, very high in magazines, especially if you're a reader of women's magazines like Cosmo. You can open up a Cosmo, and it's taking you like 24 pages of ads before you even get to the table of contents. How amazing is that we tolerate so much front matter? And that's because, in a way, advertising is as much the content of advertising is as important as the rest of the content in many ways. The top advertisers, by the way, in magazines include pharmaceutical companies, apparel companies, and accessories, purses, watches, etc., home furnishing, stuff you put around your house, furniture, drapes, etc., cosmetics, and automobiles. Those are the top advertisers in magazines. All national brands, like Ford, it's a national brand, right? All right, so those are consumer magazines, but then there's also trade magazines. It's a different kind of magazine. A trade magazine is business to business or industry to business. So, for example, there's a magazine in my field called Broadcasting and Cable. It's just for programmers who are programming channels on cable systems and deciding what TV shows they're going to put on. And they're going to get that magazine from the producers of TV shows about what's hot and what's not. What are other TV stations across the country adopting? What TV shows are they purchasing in reruns? It's a trade magazine. It's industry to business. You go into a beauty salon, you're going to see magazines in there. They're by the manufacturers of products, hair products, etc., trying to get those products into the beauty salons. They have magazines just for beauty salon owners and beauty salon workers. Those are what we call the trade magazines. Then we also have literary and commentary magazines. Literary and commentary magazines, these are serious culture magazines. These are magazines that are going to focus on short essays and fiction. Good examples include Harper's, and another one includes The Atlantic. And then also within this genre, we have a subgenre of political journals or political magazines. A bunch of those: The Nation, The New Republic, National Review. They're usually hard left or hard right. They usually have a very, very distinct ideology, political position. Now let's move on to different categories of magazines to try and find out the impact of magazines on American society. And the next category we're going to talk about is magazines that were geared towards African Americans. Yeah, magazines actually played a big role in some of the freedoms gained by African Americans, and certainly providing a voice to African Americans or early African American leaders. The magazine called The Crisis. The magazine called The Crisis was started by civil rights leader W.E.B. Du Bois. He had three initials in his name, W.E.B. Du Bois. And he promoted civil rights for African Americans. You know, that they should have the same rights that everybody else does: voting, visiting places in public, riding on public transportation. These things were talked about. He also was the first one to give an outlet to African American writers. They had no place to go if they wanted to express themselves. And now for the first time, African Americans have a place to vocalize their concerns about inequalities and injustices and just in general issues that may be important to African Americans. And this magazine, by the way, The Crisis, became the official magazine of the NAACP, National Organization for African Americans. Now let's go on to another group served by magazines, and that is the muckrakers. Have you heard that word, muckrakers? Kind of a cool name. A muckraker is a person who is involved in investigative reporting. They're digging stuff up. They're raking, and they're trying to stir up the muck. They're trying to find that. That term was coined by a U.S. president, Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt coined that term, and he used it to describe socially activist investigative journalists that were trying to expose, in those days, the corrupt railroads and oil companies right here in Pennsylvania. Yeah, that's what the muckrakers are doing, and Teddy Roosevelt was encouraging that. He liked that. The most famous magazine that did this was McClure's. McClure's magazine, founded by Samuel McClure. And this magazine went after the insurance industry, the railroads, urban problems, because of the factories coming to the cities. You had very dirty neighborhoods, people working in bad conditions. The most famous target of this magazine was Standard Oil, which later became Chevron. It's founded right here in Pennsylvania, outside of Erie. Yeah, by John Rockefeller, founded that company. There's some history for you. All right, next category of magazines we're going to talk about is news magazines. News magazines, and the name of the person, Henry Luce, is a name you should know, L-U-C-E, Henry Luce. He was born in China to missionary parents. They went there to to try and convert Chinese, probably to Catholics, I believe. And he was the person who founded Time magazine. Yeah, he's the one who founded Time magazine. What a great name for a magazine, a periodical. It was a weekly news magazine focusing on current events. And this was a magazine that was different. It didn't stick to objective journalism. What it did was it told the reader how to think about issues. And what it would do is it will present multiple sides to a story, and then it will clearly favor one side. So right now it might be looking at the conflict between Iran and the United States, and it might present options of going to war, not going to war, peaceful resolution, not peaceful resolution, sanctions, not sanctions, and then it's going to come down on one side. That's a formula, you can say, that was started by Henry Luce in Time magazine. He also went on to found other big magazines, including Life. This magazine here, which went out of business for a while, but came back in business and basically photographs people. He also did Sports Illustrated. Sports Illustrated, yeah, you could say that Henry Luce was majorly responsible for the entire sports fandom culture because of Sports Illustrated and following your favorite players and your favorite teams. And Luce also started Fortune magazine, that big financial magazine that does the Fortune 500, ranking the top wealthiest people in the country. Henry Luce also hired a famous female photographer. Her name was Margaret Bourke White. Margaret Bourke White, hyphenated name. And she was famous for industrial photography. She'd go around to big cities where there were manufacturing plants there and industrial revolution right in front of your eyes. And she'd take photographs of these really dirty smokestacks to illustrate what is industrialization doing to our aesthetic landscape? It's destroying. That's what she did. She was the first woman photographer that was accredited by the U.S. Army as an official photographer. And she did photo essays. So think about that. It's telling a story using a series of photos. So you could do a photo of showing a piece of land with beautiful trees on it. And then the next photo shows all the trees gone. Then the next photo shows a rusty smokestack. And that, you get the idea, right? You can tell a story. It's a photo essay. Now let's move on to the category of magazines called women's magazines. Women's magazines is one of the biggest categories of consumer magazines out there. More female readers of magazines than males. These magazines got their start in 1830 with Lois Godey's, G-O-D-Y is how she spells her last name, Lois Godey's Lady Book. And in this book, similar to The Crisis, the African-American publication, she published women's writers, giving them a voice. Previously, it was not accepted for women to become authors, and in many cases, if they did become authors in magazines, they used pseudonyms, sometimes even male names, to hide the fact that they were a female author. This magazine started to change that around. In fact, after that, a whole new genre of magazines came out called the Seven Sisters. I guess it's not really a genre, it's more like a club. Seven Sisters of magazines. These are magazines about how to live your life better, covering things like cooking, employment, health, and of course, relationships. The magazines that fit into this category, the Seven Sisters, Good Housekeeping, McCall's, Red Book, Family Circle. Yeah, those are some of the ones. And in fact, they spurn the whole fashion, beauty, lifestyle magazine genre, which is occupied by Glamour and Cosmopolitan. And tons of females are reading these magazines, but of course, a lot of that has migrated over to the web with a lot of the makeup and cosmetic influencers that exist on YouTube. A lot of that function is being taken away from magazines. Cosmopolitan is a magazine that we want to highlight. That's kind of an interesting magazine. It was founded by an editor by the name of Helen Gurley Brown, and not G-I-R-L-E-Y. It's G-U-R-L-E-Y, Helen Gurley Brown. And she had this idea that most women were mouse burgers. Yeah, that's what she called them, mouse burgers. A mouse burger is a female who is a quiet, introverted girl who also happens to have a sexy, racy, crazy, she didn't use the word crazy, we'll use it today, but that kind of naughty side to her. That's what Cosmopolitan is supposed to be about. So it gives practical advice on relationships, work, health, beauty, and sex. This was her formula. There's also, of course, men's magazines. Three big ones include Esquire, which is known for risque pinups of females in it, and also lots of air-drawn women. Not that people are not air-drawn in other places, but this magazine is known perfectly for it, especially for it, I should say. The magazine got its start as a morale booster during World War II with the men on the lines. I mean, these are very traditional, old, very binary thinking, if you know what that means, in heterosexuality, male, female. But this was the world that it lived in World War II. The Esquire was very popular overseas because of these pinups. But the writing at the same time was to an upscale audience. It wasn't at a very low level. Similarly, another magazine, Playboy magazine, has gone through lots of changes. Playboy magazine, founded in 1953, it was founded on photos of nude women, and it was all part of the sexual revolution in the 60s, promoting a sexually free life. Hugh Hefner was the person who started that, and he actually was working for Esquire magazine in promotion before he started this, and he had this idea that he could get away with naked females, which was a big deal at that time, long before pornography on the internet. He had this idea that he could get away with that if he just had really serious political articles in between all the photos. So that's what he did. And for years and years, that was a successful model for Playboy. Men could own it and say, oh, I get it because of the articles. But now, Playboy went out of business because of pornography on the internet. It started doing clothed people, and then it recently decided, and that's not working. It's gone back to naked people again. So it's still trying to find what it's going to do. Which takes us now to magazines and body image. So we start to head into some of the major impacts of magazines. Body image is certainly one area that's talked about not favorably. There's particularly a big problem amongst females with anorexia and bulimia, and just eating disorders in general, not healthy eating lifestyles. And magazines are blamed a lot for that, as well as our billboards and women in television and, of course, on the web. Body image is the idea that people are being presented in these forms of media that are not representative of the average body size that's out there. Now, it is changing. You can see actors like Melissa McCarthy, for example, popular actress. But even there's pressure for her to lose weight. And Adele and people like that, same kind of thing. So you have a lot of that going on in magazines. You have very waif-like people. And one of the most famous models who was criticized for this, she was called a heroine model, or a chic model, if you can believe that. Heroine used to describe how skinny she was. It was Kate Moss. She was, she embodies. No, that's not a good word. She exhibits. Yeah, that's not a good one either. She represents that kind of unhealthy female, and males are portrayed the same way in terms of muscle bound in magazines. Next up is the controversy of advertisers versus editors in the magazine world. And what this is speaking about is there's a constant tension there, and this happens in newspapers too, where the advertisers want to control the content and the editors want to control the content. There's a fight between them. Who's in control? And sometimes you even actually have people who are straddling the lines. They're a news story, but they're also wearing a watch that is designed by Cartier, or they're endorsing a new product for clear skin, but they're also a news person. And you'll find this in newspapers too. I mean, the ads are laid out before the stories in newspapers. So there's always this tension goes on. Who gets to have a say? And at what point is the magazine selling something? And what point is it providing information? Which takes me now to the importance of the magazine cover. The magazine cover is the very first page. It's what grabs people. Magazines have that chance in the supermarket, in the pharmacy, in the convenience store. As you're walking out, they have that one chance to grab your attention with the photo. People are reading the photos all day long, but whether they buy the magazine, that's a different thing. And the People magazine editor, People magazine, very popular magazine, the editor is Dick Stolley. He's the founding editor of People, and he says, I have some rules about the front cover. My rules are young is better than old, pretty is better than ugly, rich is better than poor, music is better than movies, movies are better than television, and nothing is better than a dead celebrity. Think about that. It shows the magazine and delving into the entertainment world. So where are magazines headed in this century? Well, like the newspaper, we don't really know. Like the book, we don't really know. We know that a lot of the content has moved over to the web. We know that the magazine version on the web can be different from the hard copy magazine. We know there's a relation there, and that the web version is trying to drive people to the paper version, and the hard copy version or the paper version is trying to drive people to the web. We know that there will be a significant presence of magazine content on the web because the web is also good at photographs. But to what extent is this, the ability to physically hold this in a doctor's office, the ability to physically get this in your mailbox and take it up to bed with you, the ability to pull this photo close to you and examine it with nostalgia? I don't know if the web's going to be able to deliver that. You decide for yourself the future of magazines. Have a great day.